Imagine an island shrouded in mystery, far from the reach of civilization. A stormy sea leads a group of travelers to its shores, where they discover something beyond their worst nightmares. Deep within its dark heart lies a being unlike any other, a figure bound by chains, awaiting the day he will be unleashed upon the world. This is not a tale of fiction. This is the chilling reality of where Dajjal, the false messiah, is chained. Who placed him there? Why is he bound? And what will happen when he is finally released? Stay with us as we uncover the prophecies, the warnings, and the lessons that every believer needs to hear. Prepare yourself for a journey into one of the most gripping and ominous stories in Islamic eschatology. The sea was restless that night, its dark waves clawing at the battered hull of the ship like the fingers of an unseen predator. A violent storm had descended without warning, swallowing the horizon in a chaos of black clouds and crashing thunder. The travelers aboard were no strangers to peril, but this storm was unlike anything they had encountered. The air was heavy, suffocating, as though it carried the weight of an ancient curse. Each lightning strike illuminated their pale, terrified faces, casting fleeting shadows that danced like specters against the mast. Hours stretched into an eternity as the ship was tossed like a toy in the hands of an unseen giant. The travelers clung desperately to anything that might anchor them, their prayers swallowed by the unrelenting roar of the storm. But even the most fervent cries to the heavens seemed to dissipate, lost in the tempest, as though the heavens themselves had turned their gaze away. When the ship was finally hurled onto an uncharted island, it was not with the relief of salvation, but with the dread of stepping into the unknown. The island loomed before them like a forgotten relic, veiled in an oppressive silence that felt far too deliberate. The jungle beyond the shore was dense and impenetrable, a tangled mass of shadows and whispers. Strange flickering lights seemed to dart between the trees, too quick and elusive to take form. The sand beneath their feet was coarse and cold, as if untouched by sunlight. The storm had calmed, but its absence felt wrong, like the quiet that follows a predator's strike. Reluctantly, the travelers ventured inland, each step weighed down by a primal fear they could not name. The path ahead was narrow, carved through the suffocating greenery, and the air grew colder with every passing moment. It was not just the cold of the elements, but something deeper, an unnatural chill that seeped into their bones. The stillness around them was deafening, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional cry of an unseen creature. Then came the sound, a low guttural noise that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. It wasn't human, nor was it entirely animal. The travelers froze, their breaths catching as the noise grew louder, closer, like a heartbeat pulsing through the jungle. Whatever had made the sound was near, and it was not hiding. Their journey had begun in search of refuge, but they were now trespassers in a place that did not want them. Something ancient and unseen watched from the shadows, waiting, as the island itself seemed to draw them further into its grasp. What they had thought was their salvation was, in truth, the doorway to an unfolding nightmare. The jungle closed in around them, the path narrowing into a dark, twisting tunnel of tangled vines and looming trees. The air was thick and damp, carrying the faint scent of decay, as if the island itself was slowly rotting from within. Shadows flitted at the edges of their vision, quick and elusive, leaving the travelers unable to tell if they were being watched, or simply imagining it. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the occasional rustle of unseen movement in the foliage. Then it came. A sound, low and guttural, reverberated through the jungle. It was a noise unlike anything they had ever heard, part growl, part rumble, like the earth itself groaning in discontent. The travelers stopped dead in their tracks, their breaths shallow as the sound grew louder, closer. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees and filling the suffocating air. And then they saw it. Emerging from the shadows, the creature stepped into the dim light of the jungle. It was massive, its form so covered in thick, matted hair that it was impossible to discern where its head ended and its body began. The hair hung in clumps, slick with moisture, and moved faintly, as if alive. The beast's hunched figure radiated a primal menace, and yet it stood unnaturally still, as though it were sizing them up. The travelers could do nothing but stare, their terror rendering them speechless. One of them finally managed to stammer, "What are you?" His voice trembled, the words barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. The creature turned its head, or what they assumed was its head, toward them. Its movements were slow and deliberate, each motion exuding a sinister intelligence. Then, it did the unthinkable. It spoke. Its voice was low and distorted, a guttural vibration that made the very ground beneath them shudder. "Come to the man who waits for you," it said, the words dripping with a strange, mocking cadence. The travelers recoiled, their fear turning into raw panic. "What is this man? Who are you?" one of them demanded, though his voice was laced with desperation. The creature didn't answer. Instead, it shifted slightly, as if to beckon them forward, its presence as immovable as the jungle itself. The travelers began to back away, their instincts screaming at them to flee. But no matter how far they retreated, the beast did not pursue. It only stood there, watching, its voice cutting through the suffocating silence one last time. "Come," it said, "or he will come for you." That was enough to break the fragile courage of the travelers. They turned and ran, their footsteps echoing through the jungle as the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them. Yet even as they fled, they could feel the weight of the creature's gaze, following them like a shadow they could never escape. The jungle itself seemed alive with menace, and the path ahead felt less like a way out and more like an invitation to something far worse. The jungle's oppressive canopy finally gave way to a small clearing, bathed in an eerie half-light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. At its center stood a structure, crude and ancient, fashioned from jagged stones that bore the scars of centuries. Vines and moss crept across its surface like living veins, and the faint smell of damp earth and decay hung in the air. The travelers hesitated at the threshold, their breath shallow and their instincts screaming to turn back. But something, perhaps the lingering influence of the beast's command, compelled them to step forward. Inside, the air grew colder, thick with an unnatural stillness that pressed against their skin. The dim light barely pierced the gloom, casting long, flickering shadows along the jagged walls. At first, the travelers saw nothing but the hollow void of the room. But then, from the farthest corner, a sound echoed, a faint metallic clink, like the rattle of chains. Their eyes adjusted, and there he was. The figure sat hunched in the center of the room, his immense frame bound in heavy chains that glimmered faintly, as if etched with some forgotten power. He was enormous, larger than any man they had ever seen. His muscular form straining against the restraints that encased him. The chains wrapped around his arms, coiled across his chest, and anchored his neck to the ground. His legs were similarly bound, the metal links taut and unyielding. His head hung low, obscured by matted dark hair that draped over his face like a veil. But as the travelers drew nearer, the man stirred. The chains groaned as he shifted, lifting his head with agonizing slowness. His face, once hidden, came into view, a visage etched with deep lines of suffering and fury. His eyes were hollow yet alive, burning with a light that seemed not of this world. "You have come," he said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying an unnatural weight. It wasn't merely sound. It felt like it pressed against their chests, filling the room with its force. The travelers couldn't respond. Their throats tightened, their courage drained by the sheer presence of this man or creature. He straightened as much as the chains allowed, his movements deliberate, as though every inch required effort. "You are brave," he continued, his lips curling into a humorless smile. "Or perhaps foolish. Tell me, what brought you to this forsaken place?" One of the travelers stammered, trying to form words. We were lost. A storm. The beast led us here," At the mention of the beast, the chained man let out a low chuckle that reverberated like distant thunder. Ah, yes, the beast. It serves its purpose well. He leaned forward, his chains rattling. But do you know where you are? Do you know who I am? The travelers shook their heads, fear rendering them speechless. The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze boring into them. You are in the presence of a prisoner, not by men, but by powers you cannot comprehend, he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. And when these chains are broken, the world will tremble. The travelers froze, the weight of his words sinking into their minds like claws. They had thought the beast was their greatest fear. But now, standing before this bound figure, they realized the true horror was still to come. The chained man's hollow eyes burned into the travelers, his gaze heavy with a knowledge that seemed both ancient and malevolent. The room, already cold and oppressive, grew denser with an unseen weight, as though the air itself bent under the force of his presence. He shifted slightly, the chains groaning like tortured metal, and his voice, deep and resonant, filled the chamber. Tell me, he began, his words deliberate and sharp, of the palm trees of Basan. The travelers exchanged uneasy glances, their instincts urging them to stay silent, yet something about the man's voice compelled them to answer. It was not a request, it was a demand, and the weight of it was impossible to resist. One of them, his voice trembling, spoke up. Basin in Jordan, he stammered, is full of palm trees. Their dates are plentiful. The chained man tilted his head, a faint, unsettling smile curling at the edges of his cracked lips. Soon, he said, his tone laced with an ominous certainty. Their abundance will fade. The trees will wither, and the fruit will fall no more. The travelers felt the chill deepen, their skin prickling as his words seemed to echo long after he had spoken them. Before they could process the grim prophecy, he continued, his voice cutting through their thoughts like a blade. Tell me, he demanded, of the Sea of Tiberias. The name sent a shiver through the group, its familiarity now cloaked in dread. One of them hesitated, but the chained man's unrelenting gaze pushed him to respond. It still holds water, he said cautiously, as if his words might anger the figure before them. The sea is vast and full. The chained man's expression darkened, his voice lowering to a growl. Not for long. Its waters will recede and the land will grow dry. The bounty of its depths will vanish, leaving only desolation. The room seemed to constrict, the weight of his words pressing against their chests. The travelers shifted uncomfortably, their fear mounting with every question. Yet the chained man's interrogation was far from over. Now, he said, his voice dripping with malice, tell me of the fountain of Zara. The travelers hesitated longer this time, unsure of what to say. Finally, one managed to reply, his voice barely above a whisper. It flows, abundantly. People grow crops near it. It gives life. The chained man let out a low, humorless chuckle that sent a shiver through them. For now, he said, his tone chilling, but the fountain will diminish, its life-giving waters reduced to a trickle. Even the land that depends on it will turn barren. His gaze hardened and his voice grew sharper, more insistent. Now tell me of the illiterate prophet. The travelers' hearts quickened, their minds racing. One of them, summoning what courage he could, replied, he has come forth in Makkah and now resides in Yathrib, in Medina. He has followers, many who believe in him. The chained man leaned forward, the chains rattling ominously. Have his people fought him? He asked. Yes, they replied. He was driven out, but others have taken him in. They stand by him. The chained man fell silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his words slow and deliberate, each syllable heavy with meaning. Those who obey him would do well to remain steadfast, for his time marks the beginning of the end, and the trials yet to come. The travelers were paralyzed, the weight of his questions and answers suffocating them. They were trapped in the presence of something far beyond their comprehension, their every word feeding a prophecy that felt inescapable, a doom creeping ever closer. The chained man's gaze bore into the travelers, his eyes aglow with an unnatural light that seemed to flicker like embers in the darkness. The room was deathly silent, the kind of silence that gnaws at the edges of the mind. The travelers stood frozen, caught between terror and a compulsion they could not explain, as the man's deep, resonant voice broke the oppressive quiet. "Tell me," he said, his words dripping with a weight that sent shivers down their spines, "of the prophet who cannot read or write." The travelers hesitated, their fear of answering nearly as great as their fear of refusing. They knew of whom he spoke, but the way he framed the question made the hairs on their arms stand on end. One of them, his voice shaking, finally responded, He has come forth in Makkah. He is known as the messenger." The chained man leaned forward, the metallic clink of his restraints echoing like the toll of a distant bell. "What has he done?" he asked, his tone sharp and insistent, like the crack of a whip. Swallowing hard, another traveler replied, "He was driven out by his own people, but he has found refuge in Yathrib, which they now call Medina. He has followers, many who believe in him and obey him." The chained man's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, but there was no warmth in it. It was a smile born of knowledge, of grim satisfaction. "And his people?" he pressed, his voice lowering to a menacing growl. "Have they fought him?" "Yes," came the reply, barely audible. "They fought him, but he prevailed. His followers stood by him, and his strength grows." The chained man's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as if weighing their words against some unseen measure. He tilted his head, his matted hair shifting like a shroud over his face. "Those who follow him," he said slowly, his voice thick with an ominous undertone, "would do well to remain steadfast, for his coming is no ordinary event. It is the herald of something far greater and far more terrible." The travelers exchanged fearful glances, their breath quickening. They felt as though they were being drawn into something vast and incomprehensible, like insects caught in the gravity of a dark star. The chained man leaned back, the tension in the room only deepening as he continued. "The time of this prophet," he said, his tone almost reverent, "marks the beginning of the end. He is the one foretold, the one who will lead many and test even more. His presence ignites the unfolding of events that none can escape." The travelers could feel the weight of his words pressing down on them, a suffocating sense of inevitability. This was no mere prisoner. They were standing before a being who spoke of the end of ages, of a destiny they could not hope to avoid. The chained man fell silent, his piercing gaze never leaving them, as though daring them to understand the full gravity of what he had just revealed. The chained man's piercing gaze swept over the travelers, his eyes gleaming like twin embers in the dim, suffocating light of the chamber. The air seemed to thicken further, wrapping around them like an invisible shroud, pressing against their chests until breathing felt like a laborious act. The faint clink of the chains, their cold metallic echoes bouncing off the stone walls, only deepened the unease. The man leaned forward ever so slightly, the tension in the room crackling like an unseen storm about to break. "You wish to know who I am," he said, his voice a guttural rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "And why I am bound in this place." The travelers didn't respond. They couldn't. Their tongues felt heavy, their words caught in their throats, as though their own bodies rebelled against speaking in the presence of this being. The man straightened as much as his restraints allowed, the motion accompanied by a groan of iron links grinding against each other. "I am no ordinary prisoner," he continued, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable edge of menace. "I am Al-Masih Ad-Dajjal." The words fell like a hammer blow, reverberating through the travelers' minds. A chill ran through them, their knees weakening under the weight of the revelation. The tales of Al-Masih Ad-Dajjal, the false messiah, had been whispered in warnings, spoken in sermons as a figure of ultimate deception and destruction. And now, here he was, chained before them, his presence radiating an aura of malevolence that filled the room. "For centuries," he said, his voice thick with bitterness, "I have been confined here, awaiting the time appointed for my release. These chains bind my body, but not my will. My eyes have seen the unfolding of ages, the rise and fall of nations, and soon, very soon, I will be loosed upon the earth." The travelers recoiled, their breath coming in shallow gasps. The chained man's gaze never wavered, pinning them in place as he spoke with an unnerving calm. "When I am free, no place on this earth will escape my presence. In 40 days, I will traverse the world, leaving no village, no city untouched. All except two, Makkah and Medina. These places are forbidden to me, their sanctity guarded by angels who hold swords of flame." The travelers trembled, their terror growing with each word. Dajjal's voice grew darker, more insidious. "I will deceive the nations. They will flock to me, blinded by my power, my miracles. I will make the heavens rain and the earth yield its bounty. I will raise the dead, or so they will believe, and they will worship me as their God." A cruel smile twisted his lips, his teeth glinting in the dim light like a predator's. "But do not think this is mercy. It is a test, a trial for the faithful and the faithless alike. Many will fall, and few will remain steadfast." The room felt colder now, the air heavy with despair. The travelers stood paralyzed, unable to tear their eyes away from the chained figure. They had stepped into a nightmare, their souls burdened with the knowledge that they had come face to face with the embodiment of ultimate deception and darkness. And though he was bound, they could feel the weight of his impending release, a shadow already stretching across the world. The chained man's cruel smile lingered, a twisted mockery of humanity's innocence. His voice, deep and resonant, carried an unnatural weight, filling the room with an oppressive presence that seemed to seep into the very walls. The travelers stood frozen, their breaths shallow, as he began to speak of the horrors yet to come. "When I am released," Al-Masih Ad-Dajjal began, his voice echoing with a chilling certainty, "I will walk the earth, and no land shall escape my presence. In 40 days, I will cover the entire world, visiting every city, every village, every place where the weak and the desperate dwell." His words seemed to vibrate in the air, carrying a dreadful finality. The travelers felt the weight of his prophecy pressing down on them, as though the ground beneath their feet might give way. He leaned forward slightly, the chains binding him groaning in protest. "I will begin with promises," he continued, his eyes gleaming with malevolent delight. "To the hungry, I will offer food. To the thirsty, water. To the poor, treasures beyond their dreams. They will come to me in droves, believing I am their savior, their Messiah. And I will give them what they desire, for a price." One of the travelers, trembling, dared to ask, What price?" Dajjal's smile widened, revealing teeth too sharp and too white. "Their souls," he said simply. "They will worship me, bowing at my feet, declaring me their God. I will perform miracles before their eyes, call the skies to rain upon barren lands, make the earth sprout with crops, and raise the dead from their graves." His voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper, yet it carried as though spoken in their ears. "But the dead will not truly return. No, it will be the jinn, those unseen shadows who take their forms. They will speak with the voices of the lost, tell their loved ones to believe in me, and they will." The travelers felt the chill deepen, their skin prickling with dread as his words painted a picture of unimaginable deception. Dajjal's tone shifted, growing darker, more menacing. "And those who refuse me," he said, his smile fading into a grim expression, "will suffer. Their lands will wither, their waters will dry, and their skies will remain barren. I will starve them into submission. Even the strongest will falter, their faith crumbling under the weight of my trials." He leaned back, his chains rattling as his gaze bore into each traveler. Only two places will remain safe from my reach, Makkah and Medina. The angels will guard them, swords of flame in hand, barring me from entry. But the rest of the world, he said, his voice dropping to a sinister growl, will be mine. The travelers were paralyzed, their minds reeling with the enormity of what they had just heard. The chained man's smile returned, colder and more sinister than before. "Remember my words," he said, his voice a chilling whisper that seemed to echo long after it had faded. "When I rise, the world will not know me as a deceiver. They will see me as their savior. And by the time they realize the truth, it will be too late." The room fell into an oppressive silence, broken only by the faint rattle of his chains, as if even they longed to break free and unleash the storm that loomed just beyond the horizon. As the chained man's ominous words echoed in their minds, the travelers felt a deep chill that seemed to seep into their very souls. They had come seeking refuge from the storm, only to find themselves standing before the storm's herald, a being bound, yet capable of reshaping the fate of the world. The weight of his prophecies and the dark certainty of his plans left them shaken, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of the trials to come. The man who called himself Al-Masih Ad-Dajjal was no ordinary prisoner. His chains, though strong, were not meant to last forever. His warnings were not given out of kindness, but as a cruel reminder of the chaos he would one day unleash. Yet, even in his words of darkness, there lay lessons for those willing to listen. The travelers realized that his strength was not in brute force, but in his ability to deceive. He would prey on the vulnerable, twist their desires into weapons, and turn their faith into doubt. His power would lie in his ability to exploit humanity's weaknesses, greed, fear, and desperation. Only those with unshakable faith, those who held steadfast to truth and humility, would have the strength to resist him. This revelation was not just for them, but for all who might hear this tale. The chains may hold him now, but the time of his release draws nearer with each passing day. His story serves as a warning to prepare the soul, to fortify the heart, and to seek protection through steadfast faith and unwavering resolve. As they left the chamber, the travelers carried with them the weight of his warnings. This was no ordinary place, and the being bound within it was no ordinary man. This was where Dajjal was chained, an ancient prison, holding back a darkness that one day would come for the world. And when that day arrives, the true test will begin. You've now glimpsed the shadow of what lies ahead, a figure bound in chains, but destined to walk the earth once more. The warnings of Dajjal serve as a stark reminder of the trials that await us all. His deceptions will test our faith, and only those who hold firm to the teachings of Islam will withstand his influence. As we end this journey, reflect on the Prophet Muhammad's, peace be upon him, guidance. Seek protection through prayer, steadfast faith, and the recitation of Surah Al-Kahf. Prepare your hearts, strengthen your resolve, and remember, the trials of the end times are closer than we think. If this video inspired you, share it with others so they too can be aware of the truth. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to stay connected as we uncover more stories of Islamic history and prophecy. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide and protect us all. Jazakallahu khair.